Well, it looks like I made a bit of an error a while ago. I thought Snow Bros was the last arcade game to get ported to the Famicom, but here's Rodland giving us one final arcade port. The arcade game Rodland was several years old at this point, as it was one of Jaleco's early 1990 releases. The Famicom game winds up being their last non-sports game for the system, and making it even more odd is something that's visible to the more discerning viewers. The Famicom version of Rodland is a Euro game. The developer Sales Curve Interactive had already made ports of Rodland to various computers in Europe, which I guess is why they had been singled out for this. Sales Curve Interactive took a lot of liberties with the arcade game when they ported it, and one of the biggest can be found in the options menu before you even get into the game. You have the ability to turn on jumping. Rodland is a side-view action game, but in its original form, it's not really what I'd call a platformer. You play as a pair of fairy siblings whose mother has been abducted. Two people can play simultaneously in Rodland, and the ability to hit each other with your attacks can be turned off and on. The goal of every single-screen stage is to kill all of the enemies. It is not, despite appearances, to collect all of the flowers. Although, collecting all of the flowers will functionally end the stage. To defeat an enemy, you hit the B button, which will fire a beam from your magic rod. That will ensnare them, and then continuing to mash B will fling them back and forth. Eventually you'll beat them to a pulp, and they'll poof away, leaving behind some kind of weapon. You can walk through enemies that have been stunned, or you can release them after you've ensnared them by pushing in the other direction. Holding up or down and hitting B will create a ladder. You can only have one ladder out at a time, so if you attempt to create a second one, then your first one vanishes. You can get by without using ladders, but the ladders are really the key to doing well in this game. They'll open up paths to escape, let you access out-of-the-way spots, and generally give you the mobility that you're supposed to lack. While Rodland isn't supposed to be a platformer, you have a huge amount of air control when you fall off a platform, so you can swerve around all over the place as you're falling. And you can safely land on enemies, though it might not be the best idea since you're still at risk of getting hit when you go off of them. There are a few more stage features to be aware of. Some stages have balloons that you or enemies can ride up all the way to the top of the screen, and there are also stages with doors that are linked. Just hit up when you're in front of one of those to teleport between them. If you do enable jumping, then hitting A will leap into the air. If you manage to collect all of the flowers before you defeat all of the enemies, then it goes to Extra Game. And in this mode, all of the enemies have turned into, it's really not clear even in the arcade version, but here they really look like blood drops. Anyways, you now have to kill all of the enemies before time runs out. When you defeat them, they'll drop a letter, and the letters rotate on a fixed timer. If you collect all of the letters in Extra, then a fairy appears to grant you an extra life. If you run out of time without defeating all of the enemies or completing Extra, then a ghost appears to chase you down and kill you. He's really difficult to avoid or catch. Speaking of the enemies here, it's a pretty diverse bunch. Even the first enemy that you encounter can split off and spawn more. But you've got the usual monsters that will charge at you, these guys that will stick out their tongue a huge distance, and bad fairies that will strafe you with what seems to be machine gun fire. None of them really move in predictable patterns. This isn't one of those games where you can set up the ladders to guide them where you want them to go. They'll reach a fork in the road and then randomly pick one. As mentioned, defeated enemies drop an attack item, and those are triggered the moment that you touch them. Any enemy who gets hit by that item is turned into a fruit card which you can collect for extra points. The missile launches in the direction that you're moving when you touch it, unless you jump on it, in which case it fires upward. The dynamite explodes in a wave that goes in both directions. The super ball goes in an arc upward and then comes right back down, while the four balls bounce around the screen for a while. Finally, the bomb has a small explosion right at the spot where you touched it. Don't worry, it doesn't hurt you. Every 8 stages in the Famicom version, there's a boss. And for the first 2, all you have to do is blast away at the enemy that's there. These alligators will spawn small alligators that you'll have to knock out of the way, and their platforms shoot up and down, which makes chasing them a pain. I wound up waiting them out in one spot. For the second boss, which is this whale, you have to shoot it in the eye, but here you can freely move around the screen. Enemies spawn from the top, and it takes 2 shots from your magic wand to destroy them. So if they're close to you when they curve away to chase you down, you're going to get hit. The third boss isn't really a boss, it's a platforming stage where you have to descend down a well. You've got all of these little enemies in it that can throw their hats at you like boomerangs. You're given 3 lives when you start the game, and you only have 2 continues, and that's all you get to beat 32 stages with. If you can't manage to get through the game, there is a cheat code. You have the ability to name both fairies on the options screen. Call the first one ICH and the second one EAT, and you can access a level select. And because I know you're going to do it, if you try to get naughty with your fairy's name, then they turn red on the options screen, though they're still normal colored in the actual game. In Japan, Rodland seems to be well liked, but maybe more for the arcade version than the Famicom one. My take on Rodland is that it's decent but not spectacular, and it's at its best when it's sticking to the arcade game. The deviations like jumping, or the new styles of bosses, don't work very well. It's also a fairly easy game. I'm not in practice at all, and I got to level 24, and I got that far despite trying to do weird things instead of just completing stages. I think the ladder mechanics are a lot of fun, but in the arcade, it's a dedicated button, while on the Famicom, they now dedicate that button to jumping. So it doesn't really feel as natural to use those for mobility. Rodland's the kind of game that you'd play, go, yeah, that was fine, and then never think of again. If you do play it though, just make sure you leave the jumping turned off.